It was a different level. It was an absolute different level.
Down, man, I'm up at 35, 70.
Yeah, it was hands down Mike.
Wasn't close.
No.
Michael Jordan never raised his voice when he took over a game. He didn't rush and he never celebrated early. Instead, there's a look his teammates learned to recognize and his opponents learned to fear. It used to appear quietly, right before everything changed. The scoreboard might still be close, but the contest was already finished in his mind. So what convinced Jordan that there's no reason to keep competing? Let's figure out. Michael Jordan did not experience games the same way most players did. For him, competition was never limited to the score or the clock. Former teammates have consistently described how Jordan evaluated opponents and situations through a running mental hierarchy that coexisted with the game.
And when I got out there on the floor first, I was coming off the bench behind Alvin Robinson, but I was still averaging 13 a night coming off the bench.
One of the most cited examples involves LaBradford Smith of the Washington Bullets during the 1992-93 season. When Smith scored a career-high 37 points against Chicago, Jordan responded with 36 points in the first half of the next game alone. The popular version of the story claims Smith insulted Jordan after the first matchup. Though Smith has repeatedly said that it never happened, however, what mattered here was not the quote. It was a comparison. Jordan had registered the moment Smith appeared comfortable sharing the stage with him. That was enough. Teammates later said Jordan treated the second game as a correction rather than a response. A similar pattern appeared during the long-running comparisons between Jordan and Clyde Drexler. The debate intensified during the 1992 NBA Finals. Jordan never publicly attacked Drexler, but teammates have said he followed the discussion closely. When the series began, Jordan asserted control early, only to remove all sorts of ambiguity about status before the games could achieve their own pace. So what was the trigger? No, it was not disrespect in the loud sense. Practically, it was the suggestion of equivalence before it had been earned. Psychologists use the term cognitive closure to describe the point at which an individual stops seeking new information because uncertainty has been resolved. The concept was formalized by Dr. Ari Kruglansky, a professor of psychology at the University of Maryland. His work shows that once closure is reached, decision-making narrows and behavior becomes more execution-focused. Michael Jordan's teammates have described a pattern that aligns closely with this framework. This distinction is pretty crucial. Kruglansky's research says that individuals with high task commitment often stop processing external cues once confidence thresholds are met. At that point, behavior becomes less exploratory and more decisive. New information is filtered out rather than absorbed. Scottie Pippen, in his memoir Unguarded, described moments late in close games when Jordan became quieter and more deliberate rather than more animated. Pippen said that Jordan did not continue testing defenses once he believed he understood them. Instead, he returned to actions he knew would hold under pressure. From a psychological standpoint, this talks of closure, not escalation. Dr. Gary Klein, a cognitive psychologist known for his work on recognition-primed decision-making, has shown that experts often reach conclusions rapidly based on pattern recognition built through experience. Once those patterns match a known outcome, the expert moves from analysis to execution. The theory helps explain Jordan's behavior. By the time outward signals, including reduced expression, slower movements, and fewer adjustments showed up, his decision-making process had already ended. What followed was implementation, and that is why opponents frequently misjudged those moments. Without visible emotion or urgency, the situation appeared open. However, practically, the informational phase was already closed. That difference between deciding and acting explains why his calm, unsettled opponents more than intensity ever could. Once cognitive closure is reached, persuasion, momentum, and negotiation stop working. And that raises the next question. If Jordan reached closure so early, How did he regulate emotion once uncertainty disappeared? That answer sits at the center of his control. Former Bulls players, including Steve Kerr and Ron Harper, say,
If you bought into that, you could spend sold anything in the world.
confidence itself has never been the issue. Premature confidence was. Once that line was crossed, Jordan's posture changed. He reduced his pace, narrowed the shots, stopped testing, and started imposing. From that point on, the game moved according to Jordan's terms. By the time the opponents adjusted, Jordan had already taken the contest into a different phase, and that leads to the next step in the pattern. Exactly what happened when Jordan decided the question of status had been settled? We'll look at what followed next. Once Michael Jordan stopped signaling uncertainty, the most important change did not happen in his own play. It happened to everyone else. In social psychology, researchers describe a phenomenon sometimes referred to as ambiguity collapse. When a dominant figure behaves as though an outcome is already settled, shared uncertainty disappears. The environment changes even if the score does not. This idea appears in the work of John Darley and Bib Latané, whose research into group behavior showed that when a central actor withdraws feedback, others lose the cues they rely on to adjust their decisions. In competitive settings, that loss does not create calm. It creates pressure. On the court, Jordan's lack of visible reaction removed reference points opponents depended on. There was no frustration to exploit and no urgency to respond to. Adjustments became harder to read because the usual signals were gone. Former NBA coach George Karl, who faced Jordan repeatedly in high-stakes games, has said that Jordan had a way of making teams speed themselves up.
Really, we had lost in the first round 2 years in a row, and we were focused, we were disciplined.
Opponents could not tell whether their changes were working. They often tried to force answers. That response pattern is well documented. Social psychologist Adam Galinsky, who studies power dynamics, has shown that when one side displays certainty, opposing groups tend to fragment. Leadership weakens, and individuals begin solving problems on their own rather than acting collectively. The result is rushed decisions, tightened execution, and internal disagreement. Jordan's presence accelerated that process. While opponents pressed, his teammates experienced the opposite effect. The absence of ambiguity clarified roles. Decisions came out simplified while responsibility was concentrated without discussion. Players did not need direction because the situation felt resolved. One side escalated because it could not read the room. The other stabilized because there was nothing left to negotiate. Importantly, this effect did not depend on dominance or spectacle. It depended on signal withdrawal. Jordan altered how every other decision maker on the floor operated by offering no emotional or behavioral feedback. When opponents finally recognized that their urgency was self-generated, the structure of the game had already moved away from them. The contest ended because he removed the shared uncertainty that competition depends on. And that leads to the next question. If Jordan learned to use silence and certainty deliberately, where did that discipline come from? The answer begins away from the arena. Former Bulls coach Phil Jackson wrote in 11 Rings that Jordan was deeply uncomfortable with emotional neutrality. According to him, Jordan preferred to hit the ground with an activated and focused approach. He had a clear expectation of how the night would go. That expectation was rarely left to chance. Jordan's preparation reflected this. He was obsessive about routine. He used to pay meticulous attention to pre-game timing, and warm-ups followed a set order. He never allowed any new introductions once the day began. This is where many of the stories about imagined slights are often misunderstood. Jordan did not invent narratives mid-game to create confusion. He used to do it earlier, sometimes days in advance, to remove ambiguity. The emotional frame was already set by the time the contest started. Teammates and coaches have said that Jordan often spoke about matchups before games, as if conclusions had already been reached, and his language was mostly declarative, not exploratory. When athletes enter competition still negotiating meaning, they react to events as they unfold. Jordan preferred to enter with meaning settled. That way, in-game moments did not redefine the night. They simply filled it in. There was also a practical side to this approach. Jordan did not trust emotion to arrive on schedule. He treated readiness as something to be constructed deliberately. Film study, repetition, and mental rehearsal were mostly about preventing surprises. Once the ball went up, there was no search for motivation or need to discover urgency. Those decisions had already been handled. This explains why Jordan could appear so unaffected by swings early in games, and that is what made the later moments feel inevitable. The game was where certainty showed itself. So now we have cracked the psychology behind that famous Jordan look. However, is it only about psychology, or is there another contributing factor to Jordan's confidence? Well, the answer doesn't sit inside a single game or moment. Michael Jordan wholeheartedly believed in earning clarity early. He never waited for games to sharpen him. Instead, he chose to treat practice seriously, and he kept up that discipline even after securing quite a few championships. That said, his routines literally became tighter with success. The Black Cat preferred repeating the same actions until they felt spontaneous. That famous mid-range jumper, that incredible footwork, and extraordinary balance were not sheer audience-impressing exercises. With tireless effort, Jordan turned them into safeguards. He often stayed on the floor after practice ended. He continued drills only to know what remained when his body no longer felt fresh. Tim Grover, the trainer who worked with him for years, used to appreciate that approach. In many interviews, Grover has stated how Jordan preferred sessions that pushed past comfort. According to him, Jordan simply wanted to wipe off doubt about how he would respond late. Due to that reason, on-field pressure could never influence his behavior. When things started to go off the track, Jordan could still hold his calm and play flawlessly, and why wouldn't he? After all, he had been operating in patterns he had already tested under tremendous trends. That confidence gave birth to the day world-famous Jordan look, which used to appear when games seemed to turn. It never talked of aggression or arrogance, it simply signaled recognition. For all that control Michael Jordan built around competition, there were moments when outside disruptions harmed the certainty. Mostly, those moments came from public embarrassment. He would be surprised to learn Jordan used to react to humiliation way differently than to challenge. When his status was questioned in closed rooms, he adjusted and evaluated. But when people questioned it publicly, he never stayed silent. In the initial days of his career, he was cut from his high school varsity team as a sophomore. Jordan repeatedly spoke about that moment in many interviews. For him, that experience was a reference point, which proved that the reputation was wrong, and he chose to correct it through performance. That pattern later showed up at the professional level. During the 1989 Eastern Conference Finals, the Detroit Pistons physically overwhelmed the Bulls and eliminated them. The loss was public. The media and analysts questioned Jordan as a player who could score but not lead a team through playoff pressure. Can you guess Jordan's response? Well, it was not an emotional outburst. The Black Cat committed entirely to strength training after that series, only to add muscle to handle contacts better. The following season, Chicago returned to the ground stronger, and the balance of power finally began to change. Another example came during the early 1990s. That time, the media was aggressively comparing Jordan to other stars like Magic Johnson and Clyde Drexler. Contrary to fans' expectations, Jordan started tracking those comparisons very closely. When those comparisons reached a public stage like the 1992 NBA Finals against Portland, Jordan responded with a jaw-dropping performance. He never wanted to live in a constant state of grievance, and that mindset completes the picture. Jordan's look has always reflected his inclination towards recognition over intimidation. Now, can you tell us at what point Jordan usually knew the game was already decided? Before halftime, during key matchups, or only in the final minutes? Drop your view in the comments. If this breakdown added a new layer to how you see Jordan, subscribe to Fame Files and explore more behind-the-scenes celeb stories. If this made you rethink a moment you thought you understood, share it with someone who still sees it as just a look.